Hello, brains. I just found out that my publisher is going to be doing another printing of this book because there is something wrong with the cover. It doesn't say New York Times bestseller. We did it! We made the New York Times bestseller list with a book about ADHD that is written for people with ADHD by someone with ADHD. In celebration of the fact that this book is doing so well, I kind of wanted to talk about the collaborative effort between myself and the publisher that happened in terms of how to make this book ADHD friendly. And I wanted to share that for a couple of reasons. One, I hope that those of you who are still on the fence about whether or not to get it or want to see how it's ADHD friendly, like it's one thing for me to say it, but a lot of you have asked, can I see it? Can I see the aspects of it that make it ADHD friendly? But I also wanted to share it because I'm hoping that more people make their books ADHD friendly. I did not realize how much I struggle with reading, not because I don't have time to read, but because when I go to pick up a book, the layout is just not my brain friendly. It's not ADHD friendly for me. And my editor, Alicia, was really wonderful in terms of encouraging me to send her what I liked and what I didn't like. It was a really collaborative process. There was a lot of thought that went into everything: the font, the spacing, the titling, the way that the chapters are laid out, what I called the chapters. Everything was just very simple, like how to sleep, how to hyperfocus, how to motivate your brain, so that you can easily find whatever chapter is relevant to you and flip right to that. I'm so excited that it turned out this way, that I got to make it so ADHD friendly, because a lot of what I was asking for, especially with the extra white space, was not typical. The publisher, to their credit, probably spent more money for every copy of this that they had to print, because they had to print like an extra 50 pages because of how much white space I wanted to be on the page. When I write in Google Docs, which is where I wrote most of this book, I quite naturally leave spaces between the sentences. I do the same when I'm writing my scripts. So there's like a sentence and then a line of space and then a sentence and then a line of space. When it came time to figure out the layout for the book, my editor was like, well, yeah, we can't do that because the book would be like 1,000 pages long, but here's what we can do. And we had a bit of a back and forth of like, would it be enough for the lines just to be spaced a little bit farther apart? And I was like, well, let's try that. Let's see if we can adjust the spacing so that we don't need a full line in between every sentence. That would be excessive. I guess it's what I'm used to seeing online. It's what I'm used to doing with my own writing, but it wouldn't have worked as well for the book. So a lot of the collaboration was what's going to be practical and doable for the publisher that's still going to be ADHD friendly for our community to read. We also made sure that every single page had something breaking up the text. So even though we had more spacing between each line so that it was easier to read, and we tried to keep the paragraph short, it still could seem like one long block of text if there wasn't anything visual breaking up the paragraphs. So we would have a definition, and that would be set apart. We'd have a sidebar. We'd have a quote from the community. There's a pull quote. There are bullet points. There's pictures occasionally. It's very rare that there's a set of pages where there's not something breaking up the text. The idea was that we would never open to a set of pages that was just blocks of text. More white space on the page, breaking up the text with visual elements. Those two things I think were probably the most important to me. I'm really happy with how this layout turned out. And one of the reasons I think it works so well for people with ADHD is it's difficult for us to direct our focus, right? Attention regulation is the challenge that people with ADHD face, or one of the major challenges that we face. It's not that we can't pay attention, it's that we have a hard time directing that attention to what it is that we're trying to focus on. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do was make it so that you didn't have to intentionally focus on reading. There were things that just pulled you in. So if you flip to a page that has a pull quote, your brain almost automatically reads that. You don't have to choose to read it so much as it kind of grabs your attention. You can accidentally read it. If you flip to a page, most of these pages, there's something that you will read without even having to direct your attention because it just kind of pulls you in. So if I flip to page 168, a lack of resources, it's bolded, it's bulleted. It's really easy for my brain's attention to go there without me having to direct it. And that makes it a little less intimidating to read. I also made sure that I wrote in a way that was conversational, so it would be easy to read. And I would read things over and over and over again. I would read things to other people. I'd read things to myself. And if I tripped over words, if it was awkward, if it was hard for somebody to follow, I would rewrite it so that it was smoother and so that it had this kind of musical rhythm to it. And there were times during the editing process that my editor would suggest something and we were going to use a different word to mean the same thing just to like make it more interesting. It kind of broke the song of it. To me, if you use one word to mean something and then you use a different word later in the same sentence, but you're talking about the same thing, that requires more cognitive effort. And so I was like, I don't care about being literary as much as I care about this being accessible and easy to read, easy to understand. Another thing that I did was I organized it so that you don't have to read it. Even as ADHD friendly as I'm trying to make this, there's still people with ADHD struggle with time management. Having time to read is something that's difficult for a lot of us. And reading a book at all, like it's still a challenge for a lot of us, especially if you also have dyslexia, which a lot of people with ADHD do. So one of the things that I did was I set it up so that you could flip to whatever chapter is something that you're personally struggling with, flip to the toolbox section and see what tools are available. It's a reference or a resource that's available that you can just kind of have nearby. And if you're struggling with motivation, you can flip to the chapter on motivation and flip right to the toolbox, or go to the what I learned section to figure out why it is that you're struggling with this thing without reading any of the rest of the book. It was really important to me that people be able to pick it up and go right to whatever they need without having to feel like they have to read a whole book. Part of what makes that possible and part of what makes this more ADHD friendly as well is the format is the same for every chapter. Every chapter has 4 sections and they're clearly labeled. The first section is my personal experience with struggling with this thing. And then there's the what I learned section. And then that's divided into subsections. You can almost even skip the reading part and just read the headers. All of these things are set up so that even if you don't read that whole section, you can kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about. And then there's the toolbox section, and the toolbox section is labeled. The tools are like, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then there's the ending anecdote, which also has a label. In terms of the font, they let me take a look at the fonts that they were considering and ultimately decide on the font that we used. We talked about serif versus sans serif fonts. There's some research on sans serif fonts that they can be a little bit easier for people with ADHD to read. So I asked about that and they said that might be true, but for paragraphs, serif fonts actually work better. And so they showed me and let me pick. And I looked at it and it was actually interesting because sans serif works great for the titles, which is why the titles are in sans serif. But when the whole book, the whole page was in sans serif, it did end up looking like one long block of text. Whereas with serif fonts, there's a shape to the paragraph that makes it feel a little bit more contained. And it made it actually easier to read. Another thing I tried to do was trying to make it engaging and visual. For the really heavy science communication videos, I write out my scripts and then we add visuals. We add the brain animations or diagram graphics to make it more visual. This was an interesting challenge because we couldn't do that. We couldn't add animations to the book. So I had my writing buddy, Teresa, help me punch up parts of the book and make them more visual. I'm not used to writing in a visual way because I'm used to the animators and editors adding graphics and animation and stuff like that. But Teresa was really, really good at writing in a way that is visual. So a lot of the images that are conjured up by some of this writing was her idea. And eventually I kind of got the hang of it too. And I would write about something that was a little bit more visual. But that was important to write in a way that was colorful. We also added jokes to break it up and make it more engaging. And also feelings. There were times when I was a little bit distant and I was talking about my experience from a distance. That didn't really work because it wasn't engaging enough. And so I had to go back and rewrite that section, remembering what it was like for me at the time and feeling the feelings that I had at the time so that I could be a little bit more connected and engaging and less like distance and intellectual. I think that's one of the things that makes it hard to read some books about ADHD is if there are experts talking about it factually, but they're not connected to the experience at the time, they're just talking about it abstractly. It's a little bit harder than if somebody's writing from the heart, essentially. I tried to do that with the book. I tried to actually sit in the feelings that I was talking about, which was sometimes really hard, sometimes really painful, talking about things like how I used to think about myself and the internalized ableism and how to fail at everything, all the things that I thought about myself or thought I should do or should be. It was hard to sit in that, but it was important to me because I wanted people to be able to read this. I wanted it to be ADHD friendly. And part of making something ADHD friendly is making sure it's not boring, making sure that it is engaging. So I tried to connect. I tried to engage with you through these pages. Oh, and one more thing I did to make it ADHD friendly was to put everything in one book, in one place where we could actually find it again. There were a lot of people who suggested, you have so much to say, break it up into 2 books. That was hard. It was really hard to put everything that I've learned over the last 7-8 years about ADHD into one book because most of these chapters could have been an entire book on their own. I didn't want people to have to remember like, oh wait, which book was this tip in? Where was the thing? Or like, wait, it's not the most ADHD friendly thing in the world to be like, yeah, wait a couple of years until I'm ready to write another book, and then another year after that for me to finish it, and then another year after that for it to be published before you get these strategies, right? Like, or I talk about this topic. I just put everything in one place, put everything into one book. And did it take me longer? Yeah, it did, because it was really tough to figure out how to get all of this in one book. But I did that so that people could have everything that I've learned about ADHD that I found helpful, or that the community has said that they found helpful, in one book, and have it be easily accessible. I'm really proud of how it turned out, and I'm really, really glad that the reviews are saying that it's ADHD friendly, because that was my biggest goal. Like, yes, it's amazing to be a New York Times bestseller, but if that came at the expense of when people bought the book, they couldn't read it, it wouldn't have been worth it to me. I wouldn't have felt like I earned it. I wouldn't have felt like I deserved that title. But knowing that I put out a book about ADHD for the ADHD community that is actually ADHD friendly, and people are saying so in the comments, they're able to read it, it's a great feeling. I put a ton of thought into making this ADHD friendly. I had a ton of conversations with my editor. I'm sure she had a ton of conversations with the people who were doing the layout, but I think it was worth it. I think it was worth the time that we put in. There's so many things that we blame ourselves for struggling with that really just aren't accessible to the way that our brains work, but they could be. You know, there were some limitations. Like, I would have loved to have more pictures and images, diagrams, things like that. I would have loved to have color. I did what I could with the limitations I had. And again, the publisher was wonderful in terms of working with me. They definitely pushed the bounds on what is typical for publishing, especially for a first-time author, to make this book as ADHD friendly as possible. If there are things that you think would have made it even more ADHD friendly, I'd love to hear about it. And I'd love for any other authors who might be watching this video, or publishers who are watching this video, to see too, like, what really matters to you in terms of making something accessible to your brain, because it shouldn't all fall on us. I end this book with a chapter called How to Change the World, and I think this is part of it. I think part of changing the world is saying, hey, it's not just for people with ADHD to use tools and strategies to help them read. It's also on publishers and authors to make the words possible to read, to make these books more ADHD friendly. And the cool thing is, making them more ADHD friendly, making them accessible to people with ADHD, also makes them easier to read for everybody else. I'm not saying that making a book ADHD friendly is all you have to do to write a bestseller, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Thank you so much to my brain advocates and all my Patreon brains for helping me make the world a more ADHD-friendly place, one ADHD-friendly book at a time. Oh yeah, and if you want the book, you can get the book. It's going to be in the description below. There's a UK version too, coming soon in March. The audiobook is already available in the UK, and you can also pre-order the UK copy, which is not hardcover. It's a paperback.
Don't you have a copy in the studio?
Original flavor, UK edition. It's the same book. Like, subscribe, click all the things, and I will see you next video. Bye, brains.